I was 26 when it happened, and even now, years later, I still catch myself replaying that moment like a scene from a movie I never wanted to star in. At the time, my life looked pretty normal from the outside. I lived in a suburb outside Denver, worked in commercial real estate, had a decent apartment, a decent salary, and a girlfriend everyone assumed I would eventually marry. Her name was Ashley. We'd been together for almost 4 years, long enough that people stopped asking if we were serious and started asking when the wedding was. Long enough that our families treated us like we were already married. Long enough that I ignored things I probably shouldn't have ignored. The truth is, by year 4, our relationship felt more like a business partnership than a romance. We rarely fought, but we rarely laughed anymore either. We paid bills, we attended birthday parties, we watched Netflix, we slept in the same bed, and somehow, despite all that, we felt miles apart. I kept telling myself it was normal. Everyone said relationships settled down eventually. Everyone said passion faded. Everyone said real love was a choice. So I chose it, every day, even when it felt like I was the only one choosing. Then my mom called one Thursday afternoon. "You're coming Saturday, right?" "For what?" "The barbecue." I laughed. "What barbecue?" "The one I've been talking about for 3 weeks." "You never mentioned a barbecue." "Yes, I did." "No." "Yes." "No."
We went back and forth for another minute before she sighed dramatically. You inherited your father's listening skills. That made me laugh. Fine. What time? Noon. I'll be there.
Good. Then she paused. "And wear something decent." "Why?" "Because people are coming. It's a barbecue. Just trust me." Whenever my mother said, "trust me," it usually meant she was planning something. I should have known. Saturday arrived hot and bright, one of those Colorado summer afternoons where the sky looked unreal. Ashley claimed she had a work event and couldn't come. Honestly, I wasn't disappointed. Lately, every social gathering with her felt exhausting. Everything became a negotiation: how long we'd stay, who we'd talk to, when we'd leave, whether I embarrassed her somehow. So I drove to my parents' house alone. My mom lived in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where every lawn looked professionally maintained. Kids rode bikes, dogs barked behind fences. Nothing ever happened. At least, that's how it seemed. Cars already lined the street when I arrived. The backyard was packed. Neighbors, friends, old family acquaintances, people I hadn't seen in years. My mom hooked me the second I walked through the gate. "There he is. Nice setup. Told you to dress decent." I looked around. Everyone actually was dressed surprisingly well. Not formal, but nicer than a normal barbecue. "What is this? Summer party? Since when do you throw summer parties?"
She smiled suspiciously. "Go mingle." That answer told me everything. She was definitely up to something. I grabbed a beer and started making the rounds. About 20 minutes later, I was standing near the pool talking with one of my dad's friends when I saw her, and everything seemed to slow down. Not because she was young, not because she was wearing anything revealing, not because she was trying to get attention. Actually, it was the opposite. She looked effortless, natural, the kind of woman who somehow stood out by doing absolutely nothing. She wore jeans, sandals, and a simple white blouse. Dark blonde hair rested against her shoulders. Sunglasses sat on top of her head. She was laughing at something another woman had said, and for a second, I forgot what conversation I was in. Then I recognized her. Claire, one of my mom's oldest friends. I'd known her since I was a teenager. She'd been around forever. Birthdays, graduations, holiday parties, backyard cookouts. She was part of the furniture of my childhood. The funny thing was, I'd never really looked at her before. Not like that. Maybe because when I was younger, she was just another adult. Maybe because she was always grouped together with the moms. Maybe because life had a way of placing people into categories and keeping them there. But suddenly, standing there at 26, I saw her differently. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. She looked incredible. Not in a flashy Instagram way, in a real way.
Confident, comfortable, alive. She caught me staring. I immediately looked away. Too late. I saw the tiny smile appear on her face, a smile that somehow made me feel 16 again. I spent the next hour trying very hard not to look in her direction, which mostly resulted in me looking in her direction every 30 seconds. Eventually, my mom cornered me near the grill. "You've been acting weird." "What?" "You keep looking over there." "I don't know what you're talking about." She followed my eyes, straight to Claire. Then she smirked. "Oh." I nearly choked on my drink. "What?" "Nothing." "Mom, relax." "I wasn't." "You were." "I wasn't." She laughed and walked away. Mothers are terrifying. A little later, I found myself alone near the drink table. I was opening another beer when a voice appeared beside me. "You know you're not very subtle." I froze. Claire, standing right next to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something light, clean, dangerous. I turned. "I don't know what you mean." She laughed. "That's a terrible lie." Was I staring? "A little." "A lot?" "A lot." I covered my face. "Oh my God." She laughed again. The sound hit me harder than it should have. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." That surprised me. She reached for a bottle of water. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I said the thing I should never have said, the thing that changed everything. "You look amazing, by the way."
The second the words left my mouth, I wanted them back. Who says that? To their mother's friend? At a family barbecue? I expected awkwardness, embarrassment, some polite dismissal. Instead, she turned slowly toward me. Our eyes met, and something shifted, something subtle, but unmistakable. Her expression changed. Not shocked, not offended. Something else, something far more dangerous. Then she stepped slightly closer, close enough that nobody else would notice, close enough that I felt my pulse hammering in my chest. And in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You're braver than I thought." Every sound around us disappeared. The conversations, the music, the laughter, everything, just gone. I stared at her, certain I had misheard, but her eyes told me I hadn't. For a second, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. Then someone called her name from across the yard. The moment shattered. She looked away first. A tiny smile appeared, and then she walked off, leaving me standing there like an idiot, heart racing, beer forgotten in my hand, mind completely wrecked. The rest of the party became a blur. I tried convincing myself I'd imagined it. Maybe she was joking. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe she was teasing me because she caught me staring. That had to be it, right? Except every time I looked up afterward, I found her looking at me too. Not constantly, not obviously, just enough. Enough that I couldn't ignore it. Enough that I started feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Wanted, seen, alive. And that terrified me. Because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't thinking about Ashley. I wasn't thinking about my relationship. I wasn't thinking about my future. I was thinking about Claire. And I had a feeling she knew it. The worst part was that when I finally drove home that evening, I expected reality to return. I expected the spell to break. Instead, the opposite happened. The silence inside my apartment made everything louder. Every look, every smile, every word. Especially those 6 words. "You're braver than I thought." I kept hearing them. Again, and again, and again. What scared me most wasn't that I'd been attracted to her. Attraction happens. People are human. What scared me was the feeling underneath it. The feeling that something had started, something neither of us had planned, something neither of us should have wanted. And deep down, despite every reason to walk away from it, I already knew one thing. If I saw her again soon, I wasn't going to be strong enough to pretend that moment never happened. The following Monday should have been completely ordinary. Instead, it felt like I was walking around with a secret embedded beneath my skin. Nobody could see it. Nobody knew it was there. But I felt it every second. I told myself the barbecue had been a weird moment, a harmless moment. One compliment, one playful response. That was it. Adults moved on from things like that. Normal people moved on from things like that. Unfortunately, I spent 3 straight days proving I was apparently not normal. I couldn't stop thinking about Claire. It wasn't even sexual at first. That was the strangest part. What haunted me wasn't her appearance. It was the look in her eyes after I complimented her. The recognition. The tension. The feeling that for one brief second, we'd both acknowledged something neither of us was supposed to acknowledge. I found myself replaying tiny details. The way she'd smiled. The way she'd lowered her voice. The confidence in those 6 words. You're braver than I thought. The sentence felt loaded, like it belonged to a conversation we hadn't actually had yet. By Wednesday, I was annoyed with myself. I was 26 years old. I had a girlfriend, a career, responsibilities. I wasn't supposed to be obsessing over one interaction at a backyard barbecue. So I forced myself to focus on work, calls, meetings, property tours, contracts, anything that required concentration. For a few hours it worked. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Family dinner Friday. You coming? I stared at the screen. Then I typed, sure. A second later, another message appeared. Claire might be there. My stomach dropped. I immediately typed, why would you tell me that? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, because your face at the barbecue was hilarious.
I nearly threw my phone across my desk. Mothers truly are the most dangerous people alive. Friday arrived. I spent far too much time deciding what to wear, then hated myself for spending time deciding what to wear, then changed outfits twice anyway. The entire drive to my parents' house, I kept repeating the same thing. Act normal, act normal, act normal. The problem was that the second I walked through the front door and saw Claire standing in the kitchen talking with my mother, every bit of that determination evaporated. She looked up, saw me, and smiled. Not a big smile, not an obvious smile, just enough. My pulse immediately sped up. Wonderful, fantastic, exactly what I needed. The evening started harmlessly enough. Dinner, wine, conversation, the usual family chaos. My dad telling the same stories he told 100 times. My mom interrupting him to correct details nobody cared about. Everyone laughing. Everything normal. Except every few minutes I became aware of Claire somewhere nearby. Across the table, in the kitchen, standing beside the patio door. And every time our eyes met, that strange electricity returned. Neither of us acknowledged it. Neither of us acted differently. But it was there, constantly. Around 9 o'clock, my parents started cleaning up. A few guests headed home. The crowd thinned. I ended up outside on the back patio with a beer. The air felt cool after the heat of the day. The neighborhood was quiet. Crickets chirped somewhere beyond the fence.
I heard the sliding door open behind me, then close. Without turning around, I knew who it was. Claire stepped beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said softly, "You seem nervous around me." I laughed. "Maybe because you're making me nervous." "Me? You know exactly what I mean." She looked down at her drink. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe." That wasn't helping. Not even a little. I took a sip of beer. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends." "What did you mean at the barbecue?" She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, long enough that I thought she might ignore the question. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Honestly?" "Yeah." "I meant you've been looking at me differently for a while." I blinked. "What?" "You heard me." "No." A tiny laugh escaped her. "Yes." "Claire, I barely saw you before that party." "That's not true." I stared at her. She stared back. Then something uncomfortable happened. I realized she was right. Memories surfaced. Holiday dinners, birthday gatherings, random afternoons at my parents' house. Little moments I'd forgotten. Moments where I'd noticed her and immediately pushed the thought away. Moments where I'd looked a little longer than necessary. Moments where I'd found myself searching for her in a room. Tiny things, easy to dismiss individually, impossible to dismiss collectively. She saw a realization cross my face.
There it is. I groaned. Oh my God. She laughed.
You really didn't know? No. That's kind of adorable. I looked away. My heart was pounding again. The dangerous thing was how easy this conversation felt, how natural, how comfortable. We weren't flirting openly. We weren't crossing obvious lines. Yet somehow every sentence felt intimate, the kind of intimacy that sneaks up on you, the kind that becomes dangerous before either person realizes what's happening. Or maybe after they realize. Maybe that's worse. The patio door slid open again. My mother stepped outside. Immediately, both of us shifted apart slightly, a detail that definitely didn't go unnoticed. My mom looked between us, then smiled. Not suspicious, not surprised, just observant, which was somehow worse. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Eventually, people left. I hugged my parents goodbye, nodded toward Claire, then headed home. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was sitting at work. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then curiosity won. The message read, "I blame your mother." My stomach instantly flipped. I stared at the screen, then typed, "Claire?" A reply appeared almost immediately. Who else would text you and blame your mother? I laughed out loud. A coworker glanced at me. I ignored him. My attention remained glued to the screen. The conversation started innocently. At least that's what we both pretended. We joked about my mom, talked about work, discussed movies, sports, restaurants. Nothing inappropriate, nothing romantic, nothing that would concern anyone. Except the conversation didn't stop. It continued the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Soon texting her became part of my routine. Morning, lunch, evening. Random thoughts, random jokes, random observations. Every notification brought a stupid smile to my face. The kind I hadn't experienced in years. The kind I used to have with Ashley. Back when everything was easy. Back when we actually wanted to talk to each other. That realization hit harder than I expected, because around the same time, my relationship with Ashley continued unraveling. Not dramatically, quietly, which somehow felt sadder. One night, we went to dinner together, a nice restaurant downtown, the kind of place couples usually enjoy. We sat across from each other, ordered food, made conversation, and I felt absolutely nothing. Not hatred, not anger, nothing. Just emptiness. At one point, Ashley looked up from her phone. "You've been distracted lately." I hesitated. "A little? Work?" "Yeah." It was a lie. A terrible lie. She nodded and returned to scrolling. That hurt more than if she'd questioned me. Part of me wanted her to fight for us, to notice, to care. Instead, it felt like she'd already checked out. Maybe she had. Maybe we both had. Maybe we just hadn't admitted it yet. Later that night, I got home. My phone buzzed. "Claire, how was dinner?" I stared at the message. Honestly, not great. A minute passed. Then, relationship problems? My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I should have lied. I should have changed the subject. I should have protected the boundaries that still existed between us. Instead, I wrote, "Yeah." Another pause. Then, "Want to talk about it?" And that was the moment everything shifted. Not physically, not romantically, emotionally, which is often worse, because emotional lines are harder to see, harder to define, harder to defend once they're crossed. For 2 hours that night we texted about relationships, about disappointment, about loneliness, about expectations, about the versions of ourselves we'd become. She told me about her divorce, the details she'd never shared publicly, the nights she'd cried alone, the years she'd spent pretending she was okay. I told her things I'd never told anyone, not even Ashley, especially not Ashley. By midnight, I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, phone resting on my chest, heart racing. Because for the first time, I admitted something terrifying. I was no longer simply attracted to Claire. I was becoming attached to her, deeply, dangerously. And the worst part, I suspected she was becoming attached to me too. A week later,
that suspicion became impossible to ignore. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. I was leaving work when my phone buzzed. "Claire, can I call you?" 3 simple words, yet something about them felt different, more serious.
I immediately answered. Her voice sounded strange, quiet, fragile, like she'd been crying. Concern instantly replaced every other thought. "Claire." A pause. Then, "Can you meet me somewhere?" My chest tightened. "What's wrong?" Another silence. Then a shaky breath. And finally 4 words that changed everything. "I really need you." The moment those words left her mouth, I knew we were already standing far closer to the edge than either of us had been willing to admit. The drive to meet Claire took 22 minutes. I know that because I checked the clock at least 10 times. Rain hammered against my windshield the entire way. Traffic lights seemed determined to stay red forever. Every delay made my chest tighten a little more. I kept replaying her voice, the shakiness, the vulnerability, the way she'd said she needed me. Nobody had ever called me sounding like that before, at least not Claire. She was always composed, confident, steady, the kind of person who seemed impossible to rattle. Hearing her sound broken unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. She'd asked me to meet her at a small wine bar downtown, a place tucked between a bookstore and an old brick office building. Not crowded, not flashy, the kind of place people went when they wanted conversation more than attention. I spotted her immediately when I walked inside. She sat alone in a corner booth. A half-empty glass of wine rested in front of her. Her eyes looked tired, red around the edges, like she'd spent hours trying not to cry. The second she saw me, relief washed across her face. That look hit me harder than it should have. I slid into the seat across from her. What happened? For a moment, she just stared at her hands. Then she laughed softly, a humorless laugh. You ever have one of those days where everything falls apart at once? Yeah, this was one of those. She explained that her ex-husband had unexpectedly shown up at her house that morning, not because he wanted reconciliation, not because he missed her, because he needed money, again. Apparently, years after their divorce, he was still making bad decisions, still creating messes, still appearing whenever life cornered him. The conversation had escalated into an argument, then into old wounds, then into memories she'd spent years trying to bury. By the time he'd left, she'd been emotionally wrecked. I hate that he still affects me, she admitted quietly. He was your husband. That shouldn't matter anymore. It always matters. Her eyes lifted toward mine. Neither of us looked away. The air between us felt different than usual, more intimate, more exposed. Eventually, she smiled sadly. Thank you for coming. Of course. You didn't hesitate. No. The word came out immediately, without thought, without consideration, and that seemed to affect her. I saw it happen, a tiny shift in her expression, something soft, something vulnerable. For the next 2 hours, we talked, not flirted.
Talked. Really talked. The way people do when walls finally come down. She told me things about herself I'd never known, her fears, her regrets, the dreams she'd abandoned after her marriage collapsed, the loneliness she'd hidden from everyone, including my mother, including herself. And in return, I found myself telling her things I'd never planned on sharing, about Ashley, about how disconnected I'd become, about how guilty I felt for staying in a relationship that no longer felt alive, about the fear that maybe I was wasting both our lives. Claire listened, actually listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, not checking her phone, not distracted, present, completely present. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and dangerous because of it. By the time we left the bar, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened beneath city lights. Everything felt strangely quiet. Neither of us seemed eager to say goodbye, so we stood beside our cars talking, then talking some more. Then somehow another 30 minutes passed. At one point she laughed and shook her head. This is ridiculous. What is?
We've been standing in a parking lot for half an hour. I smiled. Yeah. Normal people would have left by now. Probably. She looked at me. A long look, the kind that says more than words ever could. My heartbeat instantly accelerated. And that's when it happened. Not a kiss. Not yet. Something smaller. Something somehow more significant. She reached out and touched my hand.
Just briefly, just her fingertips against mine. A simple gesture, an innocent gesture, except neither of us treated it like one. The second it happened, silence settled between us. Heavy silence, meaningful silence, the kind that changes everything. Neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. We simply stood there, looking at each other, knowing. Finally, she withdrew her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. Good night. Then she got into her car and drove away. I remained standing there long after her taillights disappeared, because I knew something undeniable now. We were no longer heading toward a line. We were standing on it. The next several weeks became a blur of emotional chaos. Claire and I spoke constantly. Texts, calls, coffee, long conversations. Every interaction seemed reasonable on its own. Easy to justify, easy to explain. But when viewed together, the truth became impossible to ignore. We were becoming the most important people in each other's lives, and that terrified me. Because Ashley noticed. Of course she noticed. One Friday night we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. At least the television was playing. Neither of us was really watching. Suddenly she muted it. I looked over. She was staring directly at me. We need to talk. My stomach dropped. Nobody in history has ever heard those words and felt excited. What about? You've changed. The room felt smaller. I forced myself to remain calm. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. I didn't. Or maybe I did. Ashley leaned back, crossed her arms. You aren't here anymore. The honesty in her voice hurt, because she wasn't wrong. Not even a little. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Nothing came out. Ashley laughed bitterly. That's what I thought. Guilt flooded through me, heavy, suffocating. For the first time, I fully saw Wedding, not through my perspective, through hers. The distance, the distraction, the emotional withdrawal. She'd been experiencing it for months, maybe longer, and now it had become impossible to ignore. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Neither of us yelled. Neither of us cried, which somehow made it sadder. We simply admitted things. The relationship wasn't working. Neither of us felt happy. We'd been surviving rather than living, holding on because it seemed easier than letting go. Around midnight, Ashley looked at me. Tears filled her eyes. Do you still love me? The question shattered me, because I didn't know how to answer. And she saw that, immediately. The realization broke her heart before I even spoke. A week later, we ended things. Officially. Quietly. 4 years gone. Just like that. No cheating. No explosive betrayal. No dramatic screaming. Just 2 exhausted people admitting the truth. I expected relief. Instead, I felt grief. Real grief. The loss of routines. Memories. Plans. The future we'd once imagined. For several days, I barely spoke to anyone. Including Claire. Especially Claire. Because I needed to know something. Something important. Was I ending my relationship because it was already over, or because I'd fallen for someone else? The distinction mattered, at least to me. Maybe not morally, maybe not practically, but emotionally, I needed to know who I was. Unfortunately, life rarely provides clean answers. A few days later, my mother called. The second I answered, she knew something was wrong. What happened? Ashley and I broke up. Silence. Then, oh, not surprise, understanding. That somehow hurt more. We talked for a while. Then, just before hanging up, she said something unexpected. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are you okay? I stared out my apartment window, at the city lights. at the darkness beyond them, at the uncertainty waiting ahead. And for the first time in weeks, I answered honestly, no. After we hung up, I sat alone for nearly an hour, thinking, questioning, second-guessing everything. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Claire. My mom told me, "I hope you're okay." I stared at the message, then typed, "Not really." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Do you want company?" My heart immediately began pounding, because under normal circumstances, the answer would have been obvious. Yes, absolutely yes. But nothing about our circumstances was normal anymore. I knew it. She knew it. The entire situation had become impossible to ignore.
I stared at the screen for nearly 5 minutes, then finally typed, "That might be a bad idea." The response came almost instantly. "Yeah, probably." Another pause, then another message. 1 sentence. A sentence that made my pulse skyrocket. A sentence that told me she was struggling just as much as I was. Because sometimes the truth only takes a few words. "I miss you." And as I stared at those 3 words glowing on my screen, I realized the next choice either of us made was going to change both of our lives forever. I stared at Claire's message for so long the screen dimmed. "I miss you." 3 words. Simple, harmless on paper, devastating in reality. Because they confirmed what I had been trying not to admit for weeks. This wasn't one-sided. This wasn't some fantasy I'd created during a dying relationship. This wasn't a temporary crush. Whatever had been growing between us had been growing in both directions, and now it was impossible to pretend otherwise. I put the phone down, picked it back up, set it down again. My apartment felt unbearably quiet. The breakup with Ashley was still fresh enough that boxes of her things sat near the front door waiting to be exchanged. Pictures hadn't been taken down yet. Her favorite coffee mug was still in my cabinet. The life we'd built together hadn't disappeared. It was still everywhere, which made Claire's message feel even more dangerous. Eventually, I typed back, "I miss you too." The second I hit send, my chest tightened. Not because it wasn't true, because it was. The next few days were torture. Neither of us knew what to do. We talked, then tried not to talk, then ended up talking again. Every conversation circled the same reality. The timing was terrible. My breakup was too recent. The connection between us was too complicated. And then there was the fact that she was one of my mother's closest friends. That issue hung over everything. Neither of us mentioned it often. We didn't need to. It was always there. Every time we spoke, every time we texted, every time we thought about what would happen if this became real. A week after the breakup, Claire called. Her voice sounded calm, too calm, the kind of calm people use when they've made a difficult decision. "I think we need some space." The words hit harder than I expected. I leaned back against my kitchen counter. "Okay? I mean it. I know. I'm serious." A sad laugh escaped me. "I heard you the first 2 times." Silence, then a quiet sigh. "We need to know whether this is real." I closed my eyes, because I already knew it was real, but I understood what she meant. If we immediately ran toward each other after my breakup, there would always be doubts, questions, guilt. People would make assumptions. Maybe even we would. So we agreed. 30 days. No calls, no coffee, no dinners, no late-night conversations. Nothing. 30 days. The agreement sounded reasonable, mature, responsible. It was also one of the hardest things I've ever done. The first week felt endless. I kept reaching for my phone, kept wanting to tell her things, funny things, stupid things, important things. Every time something happened, my first instinct was to share it with her, and every time I remembered, I couldn't. That's when I realized how deeply she'd become woven into my life. The second week was worse, because the shock wore off. The absence became real. The emptiness became noticeable. I started questioning everything. Maybe this was proof we'd been wrong. Maybe what I felt was simply emotional dependency. Maybe distance would erase it. Maybe it should. Then the third week arrived, and nothing faded. Not the feelings, not the connection, not the certainty. If anything, the opposite happened. Without constant communication clouding my judgment, I saw things more clearly. I wasn't running toward Claire because my relationship had ended. My relationship had ended because it had already been over. The loneliness existed long before Claire entered the picture. The disconnection existed long before Claire entered the picture. The truth existed long before Claire entered the picture. She hadn't created the cracks. She'd simply made them impossible to ignore. By day 28, I stopped fighting the realization. I loved her. The word felt terrifying, but true. I loved her. Not because she made me feel young, not because she made me feel desired, not because she rescued me from heartbreak. I loved her because she understood me, because conversations with her felt effortless, because silence with her felt comfortable, because she saw parts of me nobody else seemed to notice, and because somewhere along the way, she'd become home. 30 days ended on a Thursday. I knew because I'd counted every single one. Around 6 in the evening, my phone buzzed. One text, Claire, 30 days. I laughed out loud, then immediately called her. She answered on the first ring. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she said softly, "Hi." That one word nearly broke me. Hi. Another silence. Not awkward, just emotional. Then she laughed, and suddenly we were both laughing. The tension, the relief, the absurdity of it all. Everything came pouring out at once. We talked for nearly an hour, then 2, then 3. At some point, she said, "We should probably see each other." My heart immediately accelerated. Probably. Another pause. Then, tomorrow? Yeah, tomorrow. I barely slept that night. The next afternoon, we met at a small park near the edge of the city. Nothing fancy, just walking trails, trees, and open space. I arrived early, then spent 15 minutes pretending not to be nervous. When her car finally pulled into the parking lot, my pulse became ridiculous. She stepped out, saw me, stopped. For a moment, we simply stood there looking at each other. 30 days of distance, 30 days of questions, 30 days of missing each other, all of it suddenly compressed into one moment. Then she smiled, and everything inside me settled. We started walking, talking, laughing. The conversation flowed exactly the way it always had. Natural, easy, comfortable, like no time had passed at all. Maybe that's when I knew. Not during the flirting, not during the tension, not during the longing, but then, because nothing felt forced, nothing felt dramatic, it simply felt right. Eventually, we reached a quiet section of the trail, nobody else nearby, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, the kind of moment that feels almost unreal while you're living it. Claire stopped walking. So did I. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The conversation had already happened. For months, in 100 different ways. Through words, through silences, through choices, through restraint. Her eyes met mine. I stepped closer. Not quickly, not impulsively, giving her every opportunity to move away. She didn't. The distance between us disappeared, and for the first time, I kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't some explosive movie scene. It was gentle, certain, the kind of kiss that feels less like a beginning and more like an arrival. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke immediately. Claire's eyes glistened slightly. Mine probably did too. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind I'd fallen in love with. And just like that, everything changed.
The months that followed weren't easy. Anyone who thinks love magically solves problems has never lived in the real world. There were conversations, complicated conversations, especially with my mother. That discussion was every bit as uncomfortable as you'd imagine, maybe worse. When I finally sat my parents down and told them Claire and I were together, my mother stared at me for nearly 30 seconds, not speaking, not blinking, just staring. Then she looked at Claire, then back at me, then back at Claire. Finally, she said, I knew something was going on. Neither of us knew how to respond. My father nearly dropped his coffee. That part was admittedly funny. The adjustment took time for everyone. Some people judged us. Some people gossiped. Some people acted like we'd committed a federal crime. Others didn't care at all. Life kept moving, and gradually the shock faded. Reality replaced it. Normal life. The beautiful, boring, complicated reality of building something real with another person. 2 years later, Claire and I bought a house together. 3 years later, I proposed. She cried before I even finished asking. I cried too, though I'll deny it publicly. My mother still teases me about the barbecue, relentlessly, every chance she gets. Sometimes during family dinner, she'll look at me and say, "Remember when you couldn't stop staring?" And everybody laughs, especially Claire.
The funny thing is that whenever those moments happen, my mind drifts back to that first afternoon. The hot summer air, the crowded backyard, the beer in my hand, the nervous compliment that slipped out before I could stop it. "You look amazing." And then her response, the 6 words that changed everything. "You're braver than I thought." At the time, I assumed she meant I was brave for saying it. Years later, I think I finally understand what she meant, because the real courage wasn't the compliment. The real courage came afterward. The patience, the restraint, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, the willingness to walk away when necessary, and eventually, the willingness to choose each other despite how complicated everything seemed. Life rarely unfolds the way we expect. Mine certainly didn't. If you'd told me at 26 that I'd eventually marry one of my mother's closest friends, I would have laughed in your face, probably for several minutes. Yet somehow that's exactly what happened. Not because we chased a fantasy, not because we ignored consequences, but because underneath all the complications, all the awkwardness, and all the judgment, there was something real, something worth protecting, something worth waiting for. And every once in a while, usually late at night when the house is quiet and Claire has fallen asleep beside me, I think about how close we came to missing it. One different decision, one different conversation, one moment of fear. And none of this would exist. Then I look over at the woman sleeping next to me, the woman who changed my life with a whisper, and I realize I'd make every difficult choice all over again.